Hello, this is Lania Knight, and I'm with my friend Roselle Angwin. I'm going to ask her some questions about writing in response to place. Hi, Roselle.
Hi, Lania. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you so much for being here with me. I'm going to start with a kind of open question, which is what got you started with writing in response to place?
I was thinking about that earlier, and it's partly because I was brought up on the North Devon coast and spent my childhood running wild, really. So place was where I was, outside all the time, by the sea, in the woods. Yeah. And I remember somebody else was asking me this the other day, and I remember my very first encounter with poetry that seemed to relate to place, uh, and actually set me on this track. And I just moved up to secondary school, and our English teacher had asked us to bring in a poem that we liked. And at the time, I was reading the book Ring of Bright Water about otters. Yeah, there's another story with that, but I'll leave that for the minute. It was a book about otters, and it was prefaced by a poem by the wonderful poet who's really not known anymore, Kathleen Raine. And she had an unrequited love affair with Gavin Maxwell, who wrote Ring of Bright Water. And I didn't entirely understand the poem, but I knew it spoke to something very deep in me. So I took it in and misread it out to the class. There were words like causality, which I'm sure I read as casualty. I just didn't know what the hell causality meant when I was 11. But I read that poem, and having coupling it with the book about otters, I knew that's what I wanted to do with my life. So the two things came together automatically. I spent all my life, all my childhood and all my adult life outside in wildish places, and then found how people could write about them. So
Wow.
I guess that was the beginning, I guess.
I love that. That's great. Thank you. What do you see as community, and how does it show up in your writing?
I've extended the last, well, possibly all my life, but kind of consciously the last 20 or 30 years, my idea of community as being the people around you, to include the whole of the rest of the natural world, which is now my focus in everything I do in my courses, my books. My thinking life, my creative life, my walking life, I am aware that, I suppose I want to say, we're all kin. And it seems to me that so many of our environmental crises stem from the fact that we don't think like that my kind of life task now has been to redefine what we mean by kin and what we mean by community. So the relationship between us and everything that is what I would say I now think of as kin. I try not to differentiate too much between the humans who are kin and the birds that visit my garden in the mornings, or the deer I see occasionally at the top of our field, or the stricken tree, the lightning struck oak that has just come down and ruined my phone line and internet for 2 weeks. Yeah, does that answer that?
Yeah. So a lot of connection.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Connectedness, I suppose, is what I would say. Connectedness is for me the
connectedness.
definition of kin, and it's not just the human with the human.
Okay, well, that's great. I was wondering if you might mind doing a little bit of reading, maybe from your novel, The Burning Ground.
Certainly. The Burning Ground. I lived for many years on Dartmoor, which is a particularly special place. I'm off the edge of it now, and it does feel quite different, even though it's maybe only 5 miles as the crow flies, less than that, fewer miles than that, maybe 5 miles by car. It feels like a different country, and I miss it very badly. So a lot of my books, whether it's poetry or whether it's novels or creative nonfiction, include my relationship with Dartmoor. And this one, The Burning Ground, is set partly in Brittany, a little bit in Cornwall, which is where I come from, but mostly on Dartmoor. And it's set during the foot and mouth crisis we had on Dartmoor in about, it was nearly 20 years ago now. I have a lot of friends who were farmers, and I saw herd after herd of animals being culled. And I felt the government very badly mishandled the foot and mouth crisis. So I had friends who were documenting it for me, and I wanted to document it in a novel. It's not a proselytizing kind of novel, but it fits into the storyline, it shapes events, and it creates the final crisis in the book. I'm not going to talk about the content of the book except to read a tiny blurb. Take 2 brothers, One secret, one woman, two lovers. Add in 2 deaths and the trauma of foot and mouth on a small Dartmoor hill farm. Under such pressure, other, older secrets emerge with devastating consequences. So that's the storyline. And this is an early part of the book. It's about a page, and the book's written in the first person. Actually, this one, I think, yeah, this one is actually shares the first person perspective with Tamar, who's the protagonist, and a lover, Elliot. So we switch between the two, but this is hers. And this is when she is looking back and recounting the story. My desk overlooks the home meadow, then the orchard and the boulder-strewn shoulders of Wolf Tor. Some days you could imagine stepping off the craggy peak of the Tor and climbing into a vast blue silence, flipping and rolling with the jackdaws and buzzards. Today, though, is more typical. The breeze is picking up. Cloud shadows scud across the hills. Below me, bantams scratch and peck in the yard. Beyond them, jeans and shirts start to dance on the line strung between apple trees. People coming new to the place see it as cosy with the poultry and the orchard, idyllic even. I've been staring out of the window for 20 or 30 minutes, I guess. Time to write. I put down the little sea pebble I've been rolling in my palm and put my fingers to the computer keyboard once again. I'm nearly 40. I'm living a life that bears no resemblance, barely even a passing one, to the life I thought I was going to live 15 years ago, except in the fact that I still write and that I still live, or rather live again, in the only place where I have always wanted to live, on Dartmoor. Those 365 square miles of relative wilderness, granite tors, galloping amber peaty rivers, hawks, bones, ponies, bog cotton, the ghosts of Stone Age hunters, Bronze Age agriculturalists, medieval farmers, rabbit men and tinners. I can't imagine ever tiring of this place, its spaciousness, its skies, its changing faces under sun and cloud and storm and ice, the green and gold and lilac blue of bracken, gorse, bluebell in spring, the vetches, milkworts, bilberries of summer, the amethyst tracts of heather, the bracken rust, the black rocks and the waterfalls of winter cascading down the hillsides like tossed, wild, white hair. That's page 1 of chapter 4.
Oh my God, that's gorgeous.
Thank you. It sets the scene for everything that happens, because there's the contrast, as you can pick up already, between the beauty of Dartmoor and the very dark story that's about to unfold. Now, Dartmoor is also dark, of course.
Right. Oh, I love it. So that leads me into my next question. So you write about other than human, and I was wondering if you could talk about what that means to you and how it influences your writing. And I heard a lot of other than human references in that extract just now.
That's a tricky question. It ties in with what I was saying just now, I think, about kin and kinship, and the fact that as humans, of course, we tend to be anthropocentric. Everything focuses on human needs. And one of the things I feel strongly about is the way we see anything that's not human as a resource for us to use. So for me, a lot of my work and my own thinking is about shifting that balance, shifting that bias. So the other than human for me is everything, every being we share the planet with. But there's also another dimension that is very difficult to talk about, and I don't even know how to start to talk about it. I mean, in some cultures it would be called the spiritual. I'm wary of words like that, but I do mean another dimension of being that I suppose inhabits everything that is, but is also more than everything that is. It's also a web of being, which is a Buddhist idea I love. They don't have the hierarchical sense of a pyramid with humans at the top. They have the sense of a great net and folding, consisting of everything, every being, and each being is like a jewel at one of the interstices of the net. And I love that idea. There is no hierarchy in it. So I suppose that's what I mean. People say of my writing, and it's been said of the burning ground, there's always another you besides the people in it, and besides the animals or birds or plants or rivers or whatever it is. And people don't name it, and I don't want to name it either, but it is as if there's another you, which may be something to do with the unified field or oneness or whatever it is that animates us all, something like that.
Yeah, that reminds me just a little bit of what you mentioned just before that, the word connectedness,
Yes.
and that image of the web. That's really lovely.
Yes. And it changes our thinking. If our near neighbor is a gnat or a mosquito or a frog or a slug or a buzzard or whatever it is, it changes our thinking about our neighbors, I think.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So of course I've just I advertised as being getting to know your neighbors. And that was it was actually a course on poetry, nature and mindfulness, which comes from my very long-term Zen practice.
Mm.
So, yeah.
It sounds like part of what you're describing is just becoming more aware also.
Yeah, exactly that. Waking up is what the Buddha would say. Waking up. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I have another question for you. What have been your most meaningful writing experiences?
Oh, there have been so many, but I suppose two that come to mind is there's a creative writing tutor, Rupert Lloydell, who's an old friend of mine and a very prolific writer, very active in the poetry scene and the writing scene generally. He works at Falmouth. And we set up, years ago now, we set up a project where we were going to send to each other via a linking mechanism, which I'm not supposed to disclose, 100 words in 100 days by email, and to respond, we had to respond by the next day. And that was a really exciting project. I can't speak for Rupert, but for myself, it brought out a voice I didn't know I had. And at the end of that time, Rupert was then also a publisher. Actually, he still was also a publisher. And he brought this book out under the title A Hawk into Everywhere, as in buzzard, hawk, into everywhere. And we didn't edit it. And I think for me, that's one of the most exciting projects I've ever done. Actually, there've been loads, but that was one. Another one, quite a challenging project for me because of my politics, was to work at a boys' public school in Dorset. And I had all sorts of prejudices about the public school system, and I thought I'd go in and subvert them. Well, I did go in and subvert them, but actually with the approval of my head of department, which was great. And we had some wonderful pieces of performance writing that we created there, that we took out into the streets of the local town. And that was a very exciting experience, partly because it challenged my prejudices and partly because I got to live in a very beautiful house for the duration with my 2 dogs. The long story behind that. And I suppose the next one would be River Sweet, which is the long Dartmoor poem, which was a commission. But the brief was tricky. In Devon, we have quite a lot of very, very tiny rural primary schools that are often in relatively deprived areas and don't have a lot of funding for one reason or another. I think the local education authority is conscious of the idea that moving from a tiny rural Devon primary school up to secondary school, where there'll be hundreds and hundreds of students, is probably quite daunting. So they set up a project to have me as a writer and then 3 musicians, composer musicians, go into 9 schools, 3 secondary schools, and the 6 primaries that fed into those secondary schools. And my brief was to write a long poem that could be understood by 5-year-olds, related to by A-level students, and be performable to adults. And that's quite a tricky brief.
Wow, no challenge there.
Well, I got locked into a private room at a very old coaching inn on Dartmoor with a glass of red wine by a friend who said, "I'll let you out in 4 hours' time, write that bloody poem." So because I was about a week off my deadline, and I got masses of notes, and I'd done masses of walks following the River Dart, which was part of my idea. And I did write it in one long hit. And that was a really exciting project. And what was very exciting was taking it into the schools and seeing how the very different composers worked with the children to create pieces of writing. Each composer took a theme or a sentence or a section of the long poem to work with. Sometimes it was obviously because there are 7 sections, so obviously some worked with 2 or 3 sections, and their children and their older students as well, the primary school children and the older students, to create their own pieces of performance. And that was really exciting. They were performed at the 3 secondary schools with the primary school children involved, of course, to quite big audiences, and that was lovely. And then the book River Sweet came out of it with beautiful water photographs by a friend who lives on the moor.
Okay.
So yeah,
Would you mind reading?
So many. Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, I'll probably read you the first 2 sections. How are we doing for time?
We have about 14 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to, yeah, the first 2 sections will probably take 4, maybe 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'll stop earlier than that, though, if it looks like it's going on a bit. So this is River Sweet, and that's the lovely
Beautiful.
cover, which goes right the way across the book.
Wow, beautiful.
Yes, and there are beautiful, beautiful photos inside. So this is River Sweet 1. You'll see echoes of what I read to you from the novel. You find yourself here again, as if in dream. This bleak bog, black and ochre home to cotton grass and kestrels, shaped flints, a sheep's skull. In the absences where small deaths press, scatter of fleece like dirty snow, a spike of bone, a tangled wreath of feather and sinew. Where the winds prowl, where the buzzard's cry falls through space and there's no ear but your own to catch it. Easy to believe you're at the edges of the earth, that you might forget your name and no one to call it. Here, darkness waits close at hand, shadowing the day the way a nightmare tracks you. Just a tangle of voices, you shiver. Maybe the long dead crisscrossing the heavy air. Tinners, hunters, tribesmen whose lives have littered this land for thousands of years. Flesh become bog cotton, mouse and mud. Or a wild baying like the hounds of hell. Your own fear following you like a grey wolf, ghosting your footsteps. Here where the heart of Devon clenches tight and squeezes out its rivers like arteries clotted with granite, Dart and Tavy, Tean and Tor and Ockmont, opening from the earth's dark magma like creases in the palm of a hand. We are made of all this, peat bog and granite, slate and the soft red sandstone that yields to the sea's caress. Water. You're unwinding these stories down from the iron black night of the moor. Two, lower now where the dawn horses gather, pooled in blue morning amongst the granite and gorse. You step over the threshold through a doorway of light. You meet yourself coming back the other way, and suddenly nothing's the same. And the hand of morning opens, throws these wild rivers to dance down the slopes, fox red bracken, new green, a blanket of bluebell, past the scribbles of stone rows and circles. And here, the river curls gentle as a sleeping baby. Ash and alder lean to comb the water, hazel and rowan and willow. And you take your shoes off. It's the spring you thought would never come, though the trees are still bearded with winter, and the turf damp and riddled with sheep and rabbit scat, roots of heather, twists of gorse. But the river pools in swirls of froth and brandy, soft black soil, and frogs creaking like doors. And see here wild duck, sliding amongst marsh marigold and frog spawn. Out of the mist, walking towards the land of the living, though still the voices call.
Wow.
I must just show you another one of the photos. Are just so lovely. That, as I say, they're all photos of Dartmoor water. Can you see that?
That's gorgeous. Oh my gosh.
Beautiful colours. Yeah,
Wow.
so that's River Sweet, and that's now quite old, but it's gone through various incarnations as CDs, as a small booklet, hung in all sorts of strange places, and then in that form.
Wow.
So,
I love the combination of all the different tasks of working with different age groups and working with musicians
yes, yes,
and just and the musicality of the words too. I mean, it's gorgeous, and the visual. I don't know all the things that you're describing, but I know a lot of them, and I can sort of
yeah,
fill it
yeah.
in, and it's just gorgeous. So I have one last question for you before we finish. I wondered if you might talk about your workshops just a little bit. And
Mm.
so I met you through one of your workshops. I don't know if you remember.
Of course I
Um,
do.
Good, and it was about place and writing in
Yeah,
response to place,
yeah.
and I took that workshop at a time when I wanted to understand more what it meant to live here in the United Kingdom, and which I feel like I understand in so many different ways now. And your workshop was sort of the beginning of that for me. Um, but I know you teach a range of different kinds of workshops, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and maybe talk about the kind of writers who show up for your workshops.
Oh, yeah, that last bit's trickier because there's
Okay.
such a range. But my workshops are now cohering more and more and more around the one theme,
Okay.
um, in various ways. And the theme is to do with changing our relationship to the other than human. So I'm going to start with the second bit of your question first. I get such a range of people, but all of them I notice are looking, is it fair to say they're looking for a more connected way of being and therefore a more connected way of writing? I think it might be true to say that.
Hmm.
Um, there's something about what I call, rather in a rather cliched way, factor X that seems important to me, something more than teaching the structure of writing or the rules around writing or how to make a good poem. It's more to do with how to touch the place inside you from where these things can emerge. I suppose that's what these people have in common. And almost all of my land-based residential workshops take place in beautiful and wildish places. I say wildish because it's not terribly wild in Britain anymore, or even in France, where you've attended workshops there
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
But places where you do get a sense that there's something other than the human that inhabits that particular place. So my Isle of Iona courses, I've been leading those for 20 years now, and I have a core of people who come back year after year, and we spend a lot of time outside with the wind and the water and the rain or whatever it is that the island is giving us. Often it's sun, actually. But it's usually quite cold. I go up there in April, and the sea, because it's white sand, the sea is very clear, very beautiful. And one of the things I spend a lot of time working with actually a lot of the time on my workshops is spent with this. People drop into it quite quickly generally, but it's to do with being silent and listening. Backtracking a little bit, John Mote, who was one of the founders of the Avon Foundation and their writing centres, I went to a workshop he led many, many, many years ago, and he told us all at the very beginning to write the 5 senses, the 5 physical senses at the top of our piece of paper: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. And I've never forgotten that. So one of the things I do early on in any of my outdoor workshops is to ask people to just drop quietly down into being in their body, out in these landscapes. And something I notice a lot is that in the West anyway, we seem to be very tuned to the visual sense. So we're looking around us, which is great, of course. But early on, I asked people to close their eyes and to be aware of their other senses. So the visual has gone for the moment. So then we tune into the auditory sense and the olfactory sense, and to some extent the gustatory. I mean, you can't eat everything you meet on a walk, obviously. So a bit more careful with that one. And the
Right.
haptic sense, so that people can start to get a more rounded way of perceiving the land around them, and to write from that place of kind of waking up to the other senses first of all, but to write it without any expectation of it being good writing, and without at the moment any sense of structure. Then as we work through the week, say, we'll bring in structure more and more, and we'll look at redrafting those pieces of writing so that they're as strong as they might be. So I start sort of from the inside out, I guess, when I'm leading a workshop. And one of the things that people notice is things like I'm saying, take your shoes off. And they say, but it's cold and it's muddy. And I say, yeah, and, so we do that sort of thing quite a lot, just bringing ourselves back into our bodies. And then
Right.
I'm looking for, as I said earlier, kind of factor X, something that's more than our relationship through the senses and that links us all in some way or another.
Right.
Does that in any way answer the question you asked me?
Yes, absolutely. And it's so interesting how it brings me back to a lot of my experience of your workshop. And sometimes I do little walking excursions with my students um, before COVID. Uh,
Yeah,
and and one of the things that I do is I have them walk in silence for a bit. And it is really difficult to get them to be quiet, because
yeah,
of course they want to chat.
yeah,
But yeah, just yeah, that reminder of listening, and closing your eyes and experiencing it with the senses. And I don't know if I heard you say that before about starting from the inside out, but that really makes sense. That it
mm, mm,
that is how it felt, being in your workshop, sort of like sinking into yourself and then taking that quietness and bringing it out into the
yeah,
world,
yeah.
and letting the world come at you in a way that maybe you hadn't before that.
Yeah, because we often do it the other way around, don't we? I have
Exactly.
one of my common workshops, frequent workshops, is what I call a ground of being workshop, and I lead that up on Dartmoor. There's a particular place that I love that is a double stone row from possibly the late Neolithic age or possibly the early Bronze Age, and it leads to a stone circle. And I'd parked up in their car park, and I was meeting the group I was going to work with, who'd worked with me a few times before up there, and we were walking it. The whole journey was in silence. And there was a group of ramblers turned up and parked their cars next to me. You know what ramblers are in England. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know whether you have them in America or not.
Yeah, I've
Um,
learned.
yeah. And the leader said to me, where are you going? And I said, well, as far as the stone circle to start with. And he said, oh, 5 minutes then. And I said, no, more like 3 hours. And he could not believe his ears. He couldn't believe what I was saying, but it did. And it does, even with children or early
Yep.
secondary students with whom I also work up there. Once they really drop into noticing, something changes, and they can take a very long time to walk to the half mile where we begin walk the half mile where we begin the stone rows. And I love that. I love seeing people completely immersed in the
Yeah,
experience and writing as they go.
exactly. Oh, well, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Roselle. I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
This has been so fantastic. And if people want to find you or find your reading, your work, your writings, your workshops, how would they find you? Do you have a website online?
I've got a couple of websites. One
Uh-huh.
is
Okay.
thewildways.co.uk, all lowercase, and the other one is Roselle-Angwin, also all lowercase, .co.uk. So
Okay.
yeah,
Great. Okay.
it's been
Thank you
lovely
so
talking to you.
much. It's been
Thank you for
lovely
inviting
talking to
me.
you too. Okay. I'll see you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.